Hi there and welcome to the Firm Foundation series. My name is Dale Yancy. Today we're on lesson 32, the Golden Age of Solomon. Well, there is a young man with artistic talent. He was born in 1901. He tried to get a business going in 1919 and it crashed in less than a month. Later in 1923 he was at it again, but this time he lasted less than a year and he went under. Walt went from investor to investor with a sketch of a little mouse begging for help. He went bankrupt once. He was taken over twice. He had to start again. He determined to build a theme park that would provide a family with lots of fun for the price of $1 per ticket. Some laughed and some just politely refused his proposal. But Walt and his brother Roy, they mortgaged all that they had to open Disneyland in 1956 in Anaheim, California. And then later, 1 year after Walt's death in 1966, construction of Disney World in Florida would begin. Today, what really matters about Walt Disney is not how he started, but how he finished. And we come now to the Golden Age of Solomon. And as we're going to see, Solomon was the exact opposite of Walt Disney. In a sense, Solomon was born with a golden spoon in his mouth. He had everything going for him. He started out well, but unfortunately, he didn't finish well, as we'll soon see. Solomon is David's second son by Bathsheba, and you may remember that their first son died as punishment for their adulterous and murderous affair. And Solomon's reign has been called the Golden Age of ancient Israel. Yet how Solomon ascended to the throne was anything but golden. And before David dies, he appoints as king his son Solomon, who is only 12 years old at the time. And he speaks these words over him. He says, "I go the way of all the earth, and you shall be strong therefore, and show yourself a man, and keep the charges of the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, to keep his statutes and his commandments and his testimonies, as it is written in the law of Moses, that you may prosper in all that you do, and wherever you turn." 1 Kings 2:23. Well, few biblical characters manifested such contradictory elements of character, because early in his life, Solomon manifested this earnestness, this conscientious love and desire for God to do what's right. He was prayerful, and above all else, he sought wisdom so that he would be a good ruler and know how to lead his people. He built the temple for God and thereby magnified the worship of Jehovah, Almighty God. Well, before we go any further, let's review last week's lesson, number 31, David the Shepherd King. Question number 1. Where did the prophet Micah say the Messiah would be born? Bethlehem. 2. Where was David from? Bethlehem. 3. What are two characteristics that both David and the coming Messiah deliverer would have in common? They would both be rulers as well as shepherds. 4. Why is the title the Son of David a reference to the coming Messiah deliverer? Because it means that the Messiah will come from David's family lineage as well as being a shepherd and a ruler. 5. When David makes the famous statement in 2 Samuel 1:25, "Oh, how the mighty have fallen," who is he referring to? He's referring to King Saul and his son Jonathan. 6. Once David becomes king, where does he move the capital? He moves it from Hebron to Jerusalem. 7. David runs into a problem while transporting the Ark of the Covenant and the tabernacle from Kiriath-Jearim to Jerusalem. What happens? The Ark is being transported on a cart. It begins to totter. Uzzah reaches out and takes hold of the Ark to steady it, and immediately he's struck dead. 8. Why did God allow this to happen? It's because David was not transporting the Ark of the Covenant in the prescribed manner. 9. And how is the Ark of the Covenant to be transported? With the use of 2 poles and carried by 4 men. 10. When David wants to build a house for God, what does God say? Well, God tells him, no thanks, because his hands are so bloody from all the wars that he's fought. However, God does tell David that he'll have a house that will last forever, a dynasty that will endure forever. 11. What is this promise that God makes to David called? It's called the Davidic Covenant. And 12. It was spring when kings go out to war. From 2 Samuel 11:1. Where was King David? During this time, King David was on his palace roof watching Bathsheba taking a purification bath. And 13. Once David discovers that Bathsheba is pregnant, what does he do about her husband Uriah? Well, he immediately summons Uriah to come home from battle so he can be with his wife. And 14. Does Uriah go home to his wife? No. He sleeps at the door of the palace. And 15. What final step does David take to get rid of Uriah? He instructs his commander Joab to place Uriah on the front lines of battle and then have all the troops of Israel withdraw, exposing Uriah to the enemy. 16. How does God confront David regarding his affair with Bathsheba? Well, David receives a visit from the prophet Nathan, who tells David a parable about a rich man with many herds who stole a poor man's only lamb. At the end of the story, he looks David straight in the eye and he says, "You're the man." 17. Which one of David's sons tries to steal the throne from his father? Absalom. 18. What was Absalom's distinguishing feature? His hair, which ended up causing his death. Now we come to A, Solomon's succession. Now when the book of 1 Kings opens, David is old. He can no longer fulfill his royal duties. He also can no longer perform sexually, and that may sound weird, but leadership in antiquity was tied to virility. Therefore, a beautiful girl named Abishag is brought to David's bed, but the text reads that he was not intimate with her. Then David's sons immediately begin maneuvering for the throne. And we come to B, Adonijah's rebellion. And the theme here is that God is everywhere all the time, and God knows everything. Adonijah, David's eldest surviving son, he's the most obvious choice to be the new king. But Solomon also feels like he has a claim to the throne. And Bathsheba, David's wife now, she has a vested interest in seeing her son Solomon on the throne. She reminds David of an oath that he allegedly made, saying that Solomon would be the next king. David, perhaps feeling like he's having a senior moment, declares Solomon king. And let's read about Adonijah's plot to become king in 1 Kings chapter 1, verse 5. Adonijah, son of Haggith, was very handsome. His mother gave birth to him after Maacah had Absalom. Adonijah was boasting that he was king, so he got a chariot and horses and 50 men to run ahead of him. His father had never confronted him by asking why he was doing this, but Adonijah had discussed his actions with Joab and with the priest Abiathar so that they supported him. But the priest Zadok, Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, the prophet Nathan, Shimei, Rei, and David's 30 fighting men did not join Adonijah. Adonijah sacrificed sheep, cattle, and fattened calves at Zolaleth, the rock near Enrogel. He invited all of his brothers, the king's other sons, all the men of Judah, and the king's officials. But he did not invite the prophet Nathan, Benaiah, the fighting men, or his brother Solomon. So meanwhile, just outside Jerusalem's walls, Adonijah is declared king by his own supporters. Now he's very handsome, and he rounds up about 50 of his supporters and a chariot and horses, and he stages a parade to proclaim that he's the new king. However, when Adonijah's supporters hear of David's choice of Solomon, they abandon Adonijah. And Adonijah, seeing his desperate predicament, he rushes to God's altar, he clings to it. And Adonijah's actions, they reflect what is commonly understood in the ancient world as an appeal for mercy. Well, Solomon promises not to kill his older brother on one condition. He must never again conspire for the throne. And Adonijah agrees, and he and his supporters are spared, but only for a moment. Soon, Solomon is summoned to his father's deathbed to receive his parting instructions. And in a scene that's reminiscent from The Godfather, David tells Solomon to kill 2 men. He tells him to kill Joab. And Joab was David's general who killed 2 men who were under David's protection. He also backed Adonijah in his attempt to take the throne. David also tells Solomon to kill Shimei. Shimei was the previous king's or Saul's kinsman who turned against David during a coup. Although Shimei repented of his folly when David regained the throne, he still couldn't be trusted. So David's instructions, they may sound harsh, but you see, David knew that transitions between monarchs were precarious times for a nation, and that treacherous people were capable of treacherous actions during such transitions. And on a more positive note, David also tells his son to love and obey God, for in doing so his kingdom will prosper, and he'll be blessed. And then David, the shepherd boy who became a king, dies. And now we come to C, Solomon's wise request. If you could ask God for one thing, what would it be? I mean, what's the one thing that, if you could ask God for anything, what is the one thing you'd ask for? Would it be for more money? I mean, if we had more money, we wouldn't have to worry about the bills. We could buy whatever it was that we wanted. Or would you ask God for more time? Maybe that you would live longer and you wouldn't have to stress about fitting everything in. Or maybe you're in bad health, you have some health problems, and so would you ask God for better health so that you would live a long time and be really healthy and strong? Well, as we look at the life of Solomon, we're going to see a man who had it all, and yet in many ways he wasn't happy. Now at this point, Solomon is sitting securely on the throne, In addition, he follows his father's advice to love and obey God. And then one night, God appears to Solomon. Let's read 1 Kings chapter 3, starting verse 4. Well, King Solomon went to Gibeon to sacrifice because it was the most important place of worship. Solomon sacrificed 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar. In Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream at night. He said, "What can I give you?" And Solomon responded, "You've shown great love to my father David, who is your servant. He lived in your presence with truth, righteousness, and commitment. And you continue to show him your great love by giving him a son to sit on his throne today. Lord my God, although I'm young and inexperienced, you've made me king in place of my father David. I'm among your people whom you have chosen. They are too numerous to count or record. Give me a heart that listens so that I can judge your people and tell the difference between good and evil. After all, who can judge this great people of yours?" So the Lord was pleased that Solomon had asked for this, and God replied, "You have asked for this, and not for a long life or riches for yourself or the death of your enemies. Instead, you've asked for understanding so that you can do what is right. So I'm going to do what you've asked. I'm giving you a wise and understanding heart, so there'll never be anyone like you. I'm also giving you what you haven't asked for, riches and honor, so that no other king will be like you as long as you live. And if you follow me and obey my laws and commands as your father David did, then I'll also give you a long life." Solomon woke up and realized that it had been a dream. He went to Jerusalem and he stood in front of the ark of the Lord's promise. He sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings and held a banquet for all of his officials. Solomon goes to sleep. He has a dream, and God appears to him in the dream, and God says to him, he says, "Ask whatever you want from me." But rather than asking for a long life or for riches or for power, Solomon asks God for wisdom, so that he can rule God's people and distinguish between good and evil. And this request so pleases God that he not only gives Solomon wisdom, but also he gives him everything else as well. He gives him longevity, wealth, and power. Now Solomon doesn't let his newfound gift go to waste, but he becomes a prolific author, a songwriter, and a scholar. And yet the story that best exemplifies Solomon's wisdom involves 2 prostitutes and a baby. We come to D, dividing the truth with Solomon's wisdom. And the theme here is that God is everywhere, all the time, and he knows everything. Well, one of the most important duties of any king in the ancient world was to preside over difficult legal cases. And one day Solomon is presented with a doozy. Read along with me 1 Kings chapter 3, starting verse 16. And a short time later, 2 prostitutes came to the king. They stood in front of him. And one woman said to him, "Sir, this woman and I live in the same house. I gave birth to a son while she was with me in that house. 2 days later, this woman also gave birth to a son. We were alone, and no one else was with us. Just the 2 of us were in the house. And that night, this woman's son died because she rolled over on top of him. So she got up during the night, and she took my son who was beside me while I was asleep, and she held him in her arms. And then she laid her dead son in my arms. When I got up in the morning to nurse my son, he was dead. But I took a good look at him, and I realized that he wasn't my son at all." The other woman said, "No, my son is alive, and your son is dead." The first woman kept on saying, "No, your son is dead, and my son is alive." And so they argued in front of the king. And the king said, "This one keeps saying, my son is alive, and your son is dead. And that one keeps saying, no, your son is dead, and my son is alive." So the king told his servants to bring him a sword. And when they brought it, he said, "Cut the living child in 2. Give half to the one and half to the other." And then the woman whose son was still alive was deeply moved by her love for the child. And she said to the king, "Oh, please, sir, give her the living child. Please don't kill him." But the other woman said, "He won't be mine or yours. Cut him in 2. Cut him in half." And the king replied, "Give the living child to the first woman. Don't kill him, because she is his mother." And all Israel heard about the decision that the king had made, and they respected the king very highly, because they saw that he possessed wisdom from God to do what was right. So here's the scenario. 2 prostitutes come to King Solomon, and they're both claiming to be the mother of this child. One prostitute explains that the other one accidentally rolled over onto her own son, and she suffocated him, and then exchanged babies with her while she was asleep. But the other prostitute says that that's a lie, as the living baby was definitely her son. Because this was long before such a thing as DNA testing, Solomon comes up with another plan. He says, "Let's cut the baby in 2, and then you both can have half a child, half a baby." But when the one woman acquiesces, the other speaks up and says, "Please, give her baby, only don't do any harm to the child." And giving the baby to the woman who just spoke, Solomon says, "You are the real mother." Now we come to E, Solomon's building projects. Well, after securing his reign, Solomon fortifies his kingdom. He rebuilds the wall and the gate systems of several cities. He establishes regional centers from which he and his officials can administer the nation. Also, he builds stables to house his abundant horses and chariots. Solomon also increases maritime trade to the south by constructing a fleet of ships on the Red Sea. Yet most of Solomon's time and money is spent on building projects in his capital city of Jerusalem. Now, although the temple is called God's house, it is only symbolically so. As Solomon says in his prayer at the temple's dedication, he says, "Yet will God really dwell on earth? The highest heavens cannot contain you, much less this temple which I have built." And now we come to F. The Queen of Sheba visits Solomon. Well, the Queen of Sheba, according to biblical narrative, was a woman of great wealth, beauty, and power. And Sheba is believed to be either in Ethiopia or in Yemen by most scholars. It was a well-established city, and although there is little evidence outside the Bible as to the nature of the monarchy or how it was established, it's clear that the Queen of Sheba alone ruled the country and that she was not enamored by any of the religions in her own country. So the Queen of Sheba traveled to Jerusalem as she had heard about the famous Solomon and his relationship with the Lord. She came to test Solomon and to ask him some really hard questions. And as God granted Solomon the gift of wisdom, nothing was too hard for King Solomon to explain to her. Read with me 1 Kings chapter 10, verse 1. So the Queen of Sheba heard about Solomon's reputation. He owed his reputation to the name of the Lord. So she came to test him with riddles. She arrived in Jerusalem with a large group of servants with camels and carrying spices, a very large quantity of gold and precious stones. And when she came to Solomon, she talked to him about everything that was on her mind. And Solomon answered all her questions. There was no question that was too difficult for the king to answer. And when the Queen of Sheba saw all of Solomon's wisdom, the palace that he built, the food on his table, his officers' seating arrangement, the organization of his officials, and the uniforms that they wore, his cupbearers, and the burnt offerings that he sacrificed at the Lord's temple, she was breathless. She told the king, "What I have heard in my country about your words and your wisdom is true, but I didn't believe the reports until I came and saw it with my own eyes." I wasn't even told half of it. Your wisdom and wealth surpass all the stories that I've heard. How blessed your men must be. How blessed these servants of yours must be, because they are always stationed in front of you, listening to your wisdom. Thank the Lord your God, who is pleased with you. He has put you on the throne of Israel. And because of your God's eternal love for the people of Israel, he has made you king, so that you would maintain justice and righteousness. She gave King Solomon 9,000 pounds of gold, a very large quantity of spices and precious stones. Never again was such a large quantity of spices brought into Israel as those that the Queen of Sheba gave to King Solomon. Hiram's fleet that brought gold from Ophir also brought a large quantity of sandalwood and precious stones from Ophir. With the sandalwood the king made supports for the Lord's temple and the royal palace, and lyres and harps for the singers. Never again was sandalwood like this imported into Israel, nor has any been seen there since to this day. King Solomon gave the Queen of Sheba anything that she wanted, whatever she asked for, besides what he had given her out of his royal generosity. And then she and her servants went back to her country. So after the Queen of Sheba and Solomon have a meal together, she declares how impressed she is with Solomon's answers, with his hospitality, and the reputation that preceded him. And the story ends with an exchange of resources, and the Queen of Sheba returns with her retinue to her own country. And now we come to G, Solomon's mistakes. Well, beyond his many wives, close examination reveals that Solomon makes some other mistakes. In some ways, it's really surprising to read of his mistakes because he had been given so much wisdom from the Lord. And as you're going to see, his mistakes really seem to be stupid mistakes, which they do nothing to endear him to his people, but they actually create dissension and division. And I suppose really that shows us that with all the wisdom in the world, we can still wander away from God and do stupid things if we're not seeking the Lord and asking him daily for his direction and guidance. Well, Solomon's administration oppresses the northern tribes for the benefit of his own tribe of Judah. Solomon's large-scale building projects, they cost a fortune, and he increases the taxes. and that becomes like this necessary evil. In order to keep up all the building that he's doing, he has to increase all the taxation on his people. But the sad fact is that the brunt of all the taxation falls upon the northern tribes in northern part of Israel. So to collect funds and also to increase his power base, he weakens tribal alliances. Solomon creates 12 administrative districts based not on traditional tribal borders, but rather on geographical features and towns. This is somewhat how Europe came in and divided up the continent of Africa, not along tribal lines, but rather along geographical features. And it has caused so much turmoil and so many problems ever since. Solomon also requires each of these districts to provide forced laborers 1 month out of every year in order to work on his various building projects. This redistricting and this forced labor is difficult to accept, especially considering Israelites' past history as slaves in Egypt. Moreover, Judah isn't taxed at all, though they receive the largest benefits from all of this taxation. And furthermore, Solomon angers the northern tribes when he sells off 20 towns from northern Israel to the Phoenician king Hiram. And although the northern tribes once hosted the tabernacle, now that the Jerusalem temple permanently houses the Ark of the Covenant, it diminishes the religious influence. And if things weren't bad enough, during the latter portion of Solomon's reign, several neighboring kingdoms that David conquered, they break away from Israelite control. And moreover, the northern tribes threaten to withdraw their support from Solomon and to follow their own leader Jeroboam, an official that was appointed by Solomon to supervise all the labor. Solomon makes an unsuccessful attempt to kill Jeroboam, who flees to Egypt, where he will remain until Solomon's death. Well, Solomon, after a long and eventful reign of 40 years, passes away and leaves the throne to his son Rehoboam. Well, that's it for today's lesson. In our next lesson 33, we're going to look at the division of Israel. Also, I will share with you the top 4 most evil characters in the series Game of Thrones. So you won't want to miss that. And until next time, this is Pastor Joe saying, I hope you have a blessed week. I hope that the shalom, peace of God is upon you and your family. Until next time, bye.